welcome to the Global View on this Tuesday morning, the 10th of September. I'm Nadine Blaney. Great to be here with you when we can call it a comeback. All three major U.S. stock indices surged on Monday, ending more than 1% higher, with the S&P 500 and the Dow ending a four-session losing streak, and the Nasdaq rising after suffering its largest Friday-to-Friday decline since January 2022. So the top three S&P 500 percentage gainers: Supermicro Computers, Moderna, and Paycom Software. The top three losers on the S&P 500: Humana, Enphase Energy, and Merck & Co. Tesla shares gained after Chinese sales had their best month of 2024 in August, while Boeing shares rose as the company reached a tentative labor deal. Apple shares, though, ended lower, down by close to 2% after it unveiled an AI-boosted iPhone 16 just hours after its Chinese rival Huawei's trifold phone began racking up orders. So yeah, Apple's latest product launch comes as it tries to reverse iPhone sales that are falling amid tough competition in China. The latest phones use Apple's new A18 chip, which is based on a design from ARM Holdings, and has a new customizable button that can be used for camera controls. ARM shares, incidentally, rose on the news. And still on quarterlies, Oracle beat first quarter revenue estimates, boosted by growing demand for its cloud offerings from companies deploying AI. European stocks also staged a comeback overnight, with the benchmark recovering from last week's steep declines as investors await an expected interest rate cut coming from the ECB later in the week. And the absence of any major U.S. data left the market continuing to mull the potential of a 25 basis point or 50 basis point cut coming from the Fed. Mixed jobs report on Friday has the markets now baking in a 71% chance the Fed will cut its rate by 25 basis points at next week's meeting, 29% probability of a 50 basis point reduction. All eyes now are on the Labor Department's Consumer Price Index, which is due on Wednesday. It is expected to show inflation is retreating. The U.S. 10-year Treasury yield unwound earlier moves higher to trade little changed at 3.71%. Two-year Treasuries remain 3 basis points higher at 3.67%. And while the U.S. dollar did rebound in terms of the index, the Aussie dollar is sitting at 66.6 U.S. Let's get across what we can expect. Greg Smith from Devon Funds is joining us now from across the ditch. Hello, Greg. Has the sentiment continued in the early throes of the New Zealand session?
Oh, hi there. Actually, it hasn't. We're actually down 0.4% if you look at the NZ 50, but we actually bucked the trend yesterday with sort of fairly positive. But I suppose, certainly global sentiment has picked up, hasn't it? And probably not surprised in a few ways that investors are buying last week's dip. It was the biggest weekly decline for over 2 years. You sort of look at it and think, I suppose investors have been on edge about the soft versus the hard landing. I mean, a lot of the data continues to point towards the former. I think you look at those non-farm payroll numbers, they weren't that bad. Obviously, with some revisions there, there's a bit of a move towards sort of part-time employment. But yeah, the job market's cooling. It's not falling off a cliff. And you talk about the rate cut that we're going to get next week, well, barring something absolutely extraordinary. I mean, we're going to see either a 25 basis points or a 50 basis points trim. So yeah, that should help the economy, or the world's largest economy, glide onto a gentle touchdown, perhaps. But and then bear in mind as well, I guess the earnings season has been pretty strong, and also you mentioned Oracle numbers up strongly after hours, so that's gone pretty well. So I think it's all pretty supportive. We talk about September being a tricky month historically, but I think there's reasons to believe it could be a positive one.
Yeah, well, nothing goes in one direction, into infinity in any direction, I suppose. So buyers of the dip, but we did have that Apple iPhone launch, the iPhone 16. Anything in there for it, for, Aussie and New Zealand investors?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, you have to confess to being a Samsung user, but yeah, the talk about best battery life for one of the superior models, time will tell on that one. But I think the shares are flat, as you mentioned. Obviously, a lot of talk about AI, about Apple Intelligence. That's sort of being pushed to a beta version, and then there's going to be software updates sort of ongoing. I thought the really interesting thing is they sort of seem to be turning themselves into almost a sort of a health devices company as well. You mentioned of turning AirPods into hearing aids. That was really interesting. And from our point of view, the point about sleep apnea alerts was really interesting. And obviously that saw a lift for ResMed shares on their US listing. You'd expect the same today. Those shares are up around about 45% year to date. Really interesting, given the advent of GLP-1s. It's basically about increasing awareness, and for a company like ResMed that's got 80% market share, Apple also point out that 80% of people who have sleep apnea are undiagnosed. So having this function on the new Apple Watch is certainly going to increase awareness. So I thought that was quite an interesting sort of part of their update today.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I hadn't sort of connected the two dots. So that's really interesting. Okay, so let's get what happens for the remainder of the week. So get your crystal ball ready. No, I'm kidding. But one thing we've been very focused on is the data in the US, for good reason. We have the Fed meeting next week. However, we haven't talked a lot about the US presidential debate, which is upon us. I mean, what could come from this, Greg?
It's going to be the microphone's going to be off, aren't they? When the person's not talking, so it'll be interesting. But yeah, it's obviously the first debate. It's the first. Kamala Harris has sort of pretty much been hiding out of the limelight. It seems like polling, obviously you take those with a pinch of salt, it's pretty even. I suppose from the market's perspective, there's still this view that Trump back in the White House would be an inflationary scenario. So I suppose obviously there's certain geopolitical outcomes as well. That said, you've had the Biden administration upping tariffs and the like. You think of Chinese EVs. So is it that different? But maybe the outcomes could be sort of an inflationary nature. So it's going to be really interesting, as we've seen in previous debates. It doesn't necessarily sort of determine the result one way or the other, but it'd be all about getting those sort of swing voters, getting any sort of movement there. So that's going to be interesting. And also talking on inflation, of course, we've got that CPI number, as you mentioned, and barring something really extraordinary, we're going to obviously see inflation fall from peak levels. We've still got pockets of sticky inflation, so we've got services inflation, shelter, and the like. But generally, things are sort of tracking lower. So you'd have to think that read may have an influence on whether it's a 0.25% or 0.5% rate cut next week. And meanwhile, we'll be looking later in the week as well at the ECB. And also a little bit relevant, of course, in these sort of trade-sensitive times in terms of a major trading partner and what it does. You sort of feel like the Europeans are probably going to go again for another rate cut. Germany's sort of still looking pretty weak in part. So I think that'll be an interesting lead up to next week's Fed meeting.
All right. Just back to the piece on ResMed. So if we've got sleep apnea alerts on an Apple iPhone, does that improve its profile markedly? Because we still do have that prospect of GLP-1s weighing on the share price going forward. Sorry, Greg, I just thought I should delve into that a little bit.
No, and that's a great point. It's a great point. So as mentioned, ResMed have got around about 80% market share, and it's well known as well that the competitor Philips has had a major problem in recent years with a product recall. So but sort of coming off and the like. So all the talk of GLP-1s, all talk about the wonder drugs, and Oprah's been out there. We all know the story of people, but it's expensive. And the thing is, it's the GLP-1s. I suppose at first glance you take that as a negative in terms of reducing weight and weight loss is associated. Obesity is associated with sleep apnea, but there's a whole it's only around about a third of the problem in terms of sleep apnea. A lot of it is hereditary. A lot of it, weight loss won't actually fix the issue, and then you step back and it's actually all just increasing awareness about the issue. Apple said 80% of people don't actually realise they have this condition. And the other big thing is, your GLP-1s aren't funded. it's expensive. Whereas ResMed's solution is funded in the US, and as I say, they do have the dominant market share. So in a way, they're quite happy with this sort of GLP-1 sort of frenzy, which I suppose is only taken second fiddle to sort of AI this year. So yeah, they're looking, in a good space as a result.
All right, and just a quick one. Briscoes reports tomorrow in New Zealand. Is there anything from Aussie reporting season that will give you clues as to, what you can follow in terms of crumbs, what to expect?
Yeah, sure. So we had that. So you had the update across Tasman from Premier, or over your way, should I say, from Premier Investments yesterday. And so that was obviously a little bit gloomy. Ironically enough, over here, we've sort of lagged in a number of ways, particularly on the consumer side and spending. So the update and half-year numbers from Briscoes will be interesting. They've already actually said in an announcement that started last month that half-year sales are actually at a record. So there is also a feeling here that consumers are starting to open their wallets a bit more. So confidence has been picking up a little bit. We've got some card spending data over here as well this week, and all, of course, coincident with the recent RBNZ rate cut. So it sort of feels like there's a few green shoots coming through in another retail name, Hallensteins, which had a better than expected result during the earnings season. So we're coming from a very low base. Kiwi consumers have been in their shells, but there's a sign they might be coming out. And I think we're really probably looking at least we'll get two more rate cuts, I think, before the end of the year from the RBNZ. They go on a big holiday over our summer from sort of December through to February. So I think that's what will happen, and that might get the consumers even more optimistic as we head into that sort of key holiday shopping season. But half-year numbers from Briscoes tomorrow should be quite good.
Okay, we'll be keeping our eye on them. Thanks, Greg, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Bye for now.
From Devon Funds. So watch ResMed today in light of that Apple iPhone announcement. Well, let's check in. Speaking of the local market, we are expecting to see about a lift of about 1% at the open. Iron ore in Singapore did firm. We saw copper firming. Let's see what happens. Trade gets underway in just a couple of minutes' time. We'll take you through the open next.